this is a topic that that I think will appeal to the group because one of the things that we're seeing in all sectors, and your willingness to pay studies, something that you probably have to consider as well, is this growing heterogeneity. And so this talk got motivated by a text that my brother sent me. He sent me a picture of a magazine cover when he was in the airport at LA International, LAX. And so my brother is a modern progressive farmer, and an indication of that would be that he's at LAX, taking a flight, which is a long way away from Guelph, which is near Toronto. And he was surprised, and also the fact that he's a dairy farmer, and if you looked at his cell phone, it would indicate he would have live video streaming of what's going on in the barn. He would have an indication from the robotic milkers of the yield of each cow, the chewing activity, and a bunch of other performance measures. Just incredible. So the text that he sent me was of a magazine cover called Modern Farmer. He had never heard of Modern Farmer before. And so he asked me, he was surprised that there was such a magazine, and he was surprised that it would be on sale at LAX. So he has seen the cover of Progressive Farmer. He has read Progressive Farmer of it. And you'd think that the two would be the same, appealing to the same audience. Well, here's the cover of Modern Farmer. Okay? So we have an attractive woman with a large straw hat, young. And so this magazine is, for modern farmers, is where agriculture meets pop culture. Right? So maybe not what you had expected. This is the editor of Modern Agriculture. Won a number of different awards for the artistic design of it. Has a goat with her on her lap. I'm not sure, just for the photo op, you wonder if it's ever been done before. Here's a typical cover of Modern Agriculture. It usually has some sort of relative, not a pig, or not a, if it is, it's going to be a different type, or a cow. It is some sort of animal, neatly shot, with titles of the war on school lunch, organic, schmorganic, what you need about certification, and foraging is the new black, this sort of thing. In contrast, this was the cover of Progressive Farmer at the same time. Okay? This is what we typically would have thought. The 45-year-old strong guy with cornfields as far as you can see, an irrigation pivot as far as you can see. This was the subsequent cover, dealing with topics like ownership options and fueling your tank, and multiple combines. So it's this growing heterogeneity. So again, the modern farmer, progressive farmer. And I'm going to simplify the discussion of this heterogeneity in terms of this dichotomy. Okay? It's not, in reality, it's much more complex than that. But what I'm going to do is describe or provide you some numbers to support this growing heterogeneity, why it's occurring, and then, I guess most importantly, what are the implications. So this is a conventional view, I think, that most people have of a farmer. Okay? And let me make this distinction between a farm and a farmer here. Okay? In this case, it is multiple generations involved. The spouse, in case the female, and I'll get back to this later on in the presentation, likely working full-time on the farm, no off-farm work at all, multiple species, multiple generations, and the farmer. And in this situation, there was no distinction between the farmer, the farm, and the farm family. Okay? We had a single operator operating a single farm that supported a single farm family. And in the 1950s, when agriculture got government support, it got government support because they were worried about this unit here. They were worried about the farm family because the farm family was not doing as well financially, not only compared to their urban counterparts, but to their non-farm rural counterparts. They were poor. Okay, so how can we help them out? Well, there are a number of different ways. We can have support programs, increase the price of the value of the stuff that they were producing. We could have extension efforts that would improve the management capabilities of the farmer. So in either case, whether it be price support programs or extension programs, ultimately it would help the farm family, which was the objective of farm policy at that time. And at that time, the distribution was relatively homogeneous. You know, this is acres or in size, which is probably not the best measure. But if we had sales, you would see it's almost a normal distribution. And if we looked at Joe's here, and she knows the hog sector. If we looked at the typical size of operation of a hog operation in Ontario, it would have been 100 sows, farrow to finish, and that would have been very common. The median and the mode would have been very similar. So what's happened over time? First, we've had a significant decline in the total number of farmers. So it's about 1.5% per year has been a decline in the total number of farmers. And now we're at about 200,000, and I looked at it, it's significantly less in Australia. Here are the percentage changes by sector. So it's not, these are between the 15-year period. And in the livestock sector, half of them have gone out. There's been actually an increase in the number of soybean and corn farmers, and that's due to some commodity price boom that brought people in. So production is relatively the same. Total number of farmers has gone down, so as you would expect, average farm size has gone up. And it depends on where. You know, the increase has been more dramatic out west than it has. But I'm interested in the heterogeneity. Okay? So not the average. So the blue line is what I showed before, the histogram of the number of farms by size, and relatively normal. The red bar is the numbers that have come out of the 2016 census. And there's a couple points to notice here. First of all, if you sum all the blue bars, it's significantly greater than the sum of all the red bars. Okay? So we've had a decline in the total number of farms. The other is a significant drop in the middle, the hollowing out of the middle. We'll come back to this as we go through. Okay? A hollowing out of the middle, a growth in the large, and a growth in some of the small in categories, but particularly if we look at it in percentage terms. So where's the increase in the number of farms that has happened, or the farms that have sizes? It's been in the large, and it's been in the small categories, regardless of how you look at measuring size, whether it be area or whether it be number of livestock units. This is an Australian, and just picked this up, and maybe not quite as dramatic as what as what it is in Canada and North America, but I'll come back to a similar slide like this. So let's take a look. The growth has happened in the large. I'll call them the progressive farmer, and this is what we view, industrial farming. Okay, large livestock operations. This is not a robotic milker. Oh yes, it is. Sorry, a robotic milker, and then and lots of fields. Okay? And these large farmers are taking on an increasingly significant proportion of total production. Okay? So this is in Ontario, the province of Ontario, where Guelph is located. And we have some unique data on farmers that produce field crops, corn, soybeans, wheat. 2/3 sell less than 100,000. Okay? So 2/3 of the farmers sell less than 100,000, and they represent 1.5% of total sales. The largest 1% sell more than 55% of the total. 8% sell more than 90%. So it used to be, the 20-80 rule, and it held pretty, but now it's 8-90. So, it's the growing importance of the largest size. Going back to that cover of Modern Farmer, Maria Galvosa was the name. Okay? Mariah and Josh Gertson run a small farm on Maine's rocky mid-coast, providing their local community with beef, lamb, and heritage poultry. I hope it's not a big community, because this is... So what it also doesn't, is that Josh is a photographer for the New York Times. Okay? But, you know, this is the modern farmer. Growing importance. This is a book that came out last year in Canada, written by a guy by the name of Brent Preston. Okay, so a couple things to note here. The New Farm. Our 10 years on the front lines of the good food revolution. The good food revolution. These are the good guys, the modern farmer, okay? And, of course, anything dealing with the new food movement, the experts are chefs. Okay? So, up at the top, a must-read story told with honesty, humor, and humility about a passionate farmer who reminds us what our food system can and should be about. This is Brent Preston. You've probably never heard of a yang or a push-seeder, and neither have the vast majority of conventional farmers. Do you think your father has heard of a yang, Joe? And if he had, what would he think of the yang? Okay, so this, anyhow, this striking contrast, again, going back to what this farm sector was before, about 30 years ago, very, very homogeneous. But now this growing heterogeneity. Oops. So there are other structural changes that are going on. An increasing percentage are working full-time off the farm. An increasing number of female operators. That's one of the dramatic changes that I've seen at the University of Guelph, is the number of female graduates who are going back to take over the farm. Significant number. Before they were going to go back to work in the ag sector, now they're going back to work in the declining number of single proprietorships. As I'll talk about, there's an increasing role of contracts as opposed to spot markets or auction markets, and why that's going the case. And an increasing percentage of non-farm ownership of land. I'm not sure if this is correct, but in the risk management workshop at ARES, there was a speaker who said that 10% of the farmland was rented out. Would that be correct? Surprisingly low, because in Canada it's 40% and growing. Okay, and I think there's a variety of reasons why that's taking the place, and reflects some of this heterogeneity. So the reality is, we've got a very complex farm structure. We have a single farmer that can be operating multiple farms. We have a farm that had be operated by multiple farmers. And the farm family has got at least one member working off the farm. Now, this hollowing out of the middle is not unique to the farm sector. This is some work that we did for a book that's come out on craft brewing globally. And these are the number of breweries in Canada by annual output. And if we go back to 1985, there were only 10 breweries in Canada. Only 10 that were operated by 3 companies. The volume of beer consumed has actually declined since 1985. But what's happened, well, you can't see it now, but if we go further down, is that there are 800 breweries in Canada now. So, big growth in the number, but take a look at what's happened to the distribution. If you look at 2007, of the 268, there was, a number of small ones, but there were still some in the middle. Now, there's no breweries since 2012 that produce between 50,000 and 75,000 liters of beer. Right? So you're either getting big or else you're getting small. This hollowing out of the middle that we see in a variety, and we can give you a number of other examples. So here's a quick one. There are 400 abattoirs in the province of Ontario. So that slaughter beef cattle. One does 95% of the production, okay? And there are 400 abattoirs. So what are some of the reasons for it? I will argue that it's technological change, and consumer demand that's driving it, but there are some other reasons. Relative prices. It could be public programs that support prices, taxation that provide some credit, investment credit to different sizes. That's what's driving some of what you see in the craft beer sector. There are a lot of incentives for small producers, and as soon as you get above 50,000, they're gone. So there's nobody in that sector. You got to be large. Off-farm employment opportunities, market structure, and some human capital all, I think, are affecting what we're seeing in the farm sector. But the two drivers, particularly for the large progressive farmers, are technological innovations. Here, it doesn't really matter what it is. This is milk yield per cow, but whatever sector you look at, you see this rapid productivity growth, amazing productivity growth. This is pig-born, another measure of productivity. And it is also reflected in terms of multi-factor productivity growth based on gross output. Now, I think what's interesting is that up until the mid-'80s, that growth was driven largely by decline in labor and an increase in capital. So it was relative prices that drove that productivity growth. So we were using more fertilizer, more machinery. That's what was driving it. Since then, we've had sort of a steady decline in both inputs, but we've had an increase in output. So why is that? Technological change, some innovations that have occurred. And those innovations have pushed the average cost curve down. Agriculture does not have the typical U-sized average shaped cost curve. In other words, average costs go down as we increase in size, but then there is some point where we reach the bottom of the umbrella where afterwards, if we get bigger, average costs go up. Maybe we can't, it's just getting too big, we can't manage it right, all those different things. But almost all empirical studies show that agriculture, regardless of the sector, has this L-shaped average cost curve, which means that there's significant gains in productivity, significant cost reductions if you go from very small to small. But afterwards, it's relatively constant. You've got some high-cost big producers and you've got some low-cost smaller producers. What that means, though, is that the margins are small. So technological change is pushing this average cost curve down and to the right, but the margins are small. And if you're only making $50 an acre, you'd better have a lot of acres in order to support the family. So it's not the fact that the bottom of the average cost curve is way out here. It's the fact that the margins are so small, and in order to make a living, you've got to be large in order to generate to support the family. The modern farmer, it's technology, but it's information technology. Information technology that is combined with some heterogeneity at the consumer level. So combining heterogeneity we've got this differentiation at the consumer level. People want different things. Part of it is because we've got economic growth. People can afford to be choosy about what they eat. They can afford to be concerned about how it's produced. If you're poor, you don't care if eggs are cage-free or not. But if you are wealthy enough to be concerned, then you can build that in. The returns are associated increasingly with adjectives surrounding the food products. Is it cage-free? Is it local? Is it organic? Those adjectives determine these different markets. So economic growth is a factor. Demographics. Aging populations are more concerned about quality. Ethnic distribution. You know, the city of Toronto, which is an hour away from Guelph, 52% of its population was born outside of Canada, according to the last census. 52% born outside of the country. Okay, so they're from all over the world, and they don't necessarily want cornflakes for breakfast. So that changes things. And the information about it. So the part that allows this to happen is not, we've got this differentiation at the consumer level, but we've got information technology that allows that to be verified. We can verify that it is indeed range-free. It indeed is local, or it is corn-fed or grass-fed, whatever it might be. So what are the implications of that? So we've got this growing heterogeneity. Technology is spurring this. One is, who is the average farmer? Because in the past, we've always looked at these average measures that come out from Statistics Canada, or what's ABARE? Would that be the equivalent of MBS in Australia, to say, how are things going? So remember, part of the motivation for farm policy was returns to the farm sector. This graph is something that we produced for this Ontario crop sector, and it was spurred by we saw these negative values. So this has time along here. Along here, we've got operating profit margin. This is profit per sales. Okay, so 5, 10, 15%, 5%, 10% would be very good for agriculture. 10% profit on your total sales. So this is the average, minus 300, and minus 200. In the heyday when corn doubled in price, soybeans doubled in price, and then quadrupled in price in 2008, on average, these farms were losing 150%. So they were losing money relative to their sales. So why is that? This just was inconsistent because everywhere you looked, you saw brand new pickups in the countryside, brand new equipment. Well, if you look more carefully and break it down, the red line is farms that sell less than 100,000. They represent 2/3 of the total, and they had significant losses. Guess what their average net income was for the median, the median net farm income for these farms? It's a loss of $7,900. Kind of an odd value. You think, why is everybody congregated around there? Well, that's the maximum loss that you can take from one business and carry over to another. So this is not a full time. But if you look at it, so again, what is the implication of this? We're looking at what is the average. We can't look at the average anymore to tell whether farms are doing okay. That you have to look beyond that. You have to look at the distribution. In the past, the focus of agricultural policy, at least in North America and Canada and the United States, has been on income enhancement because we had a farm problem, a farm family problem, low incomes relative to others. So it was income enhancement. Are we still worried about that? If we looked at the previous graph, we'd say maybe we should be, unless you took it down. Increasingly, the government says we want to improve the competitiveness of the sector. Canada is an export country, as is Australia, so we want to be competitive in that export market. But do you focus on the farm, or do you focus on the whole sector? I haven't talked about that, but you look at the processing sector and beyond as well to improve that. Do you focus on the commodity, or do you focus on food products? So do you focus on number 2 yellow corn, or do you focus on organic corn? What's the achievement? The large or small? The efficiency of any policy is going to depend on the heterogeneity. This is not as important for you guys, but this heterogeneity at the farm sector has meant changes in farm policy. So this pressure has come not from New Zealand and Australia wanting to get rid of the Canadian Wheat Board. Why did it go? Because farmers felt they could do better outside the system. The Canadian Wheat Board is a single desk selling agency, or was. Okay, so all the wheat the durum wheat that was produced in the prairie provinces was sold through a single agency. And so if you were from Indian Head, Saskatchewan, you didn't know. You knew your wheat had to be sold, but you didn't have the resources to do it. You and the farmer in Moose Jaw and the farmer in Red Deer, Alberta were all similar. You could produce the grain, but you had no idea how to sell it, so you relied on a single desk selling agency. We're going to pull our wheat together, and then they're going to try to sell it outside. Worked very well when the sector was homogeneous. Because what was good for Joe, was good for Ross, was good for Dave, was good for everybody. Okay? Now, with technology, people can go outside. They can do better than the system. So farmers would say, hey, I see there's higher prices for wheat in Great Falls, Montana. They would go from Red Deer and bring their wheat and sell it there. So the single desk selling agency disbanded because of the heterogeneity. It was good when we had a homogeneous sector, but the internal pressures caused it to change. The dairy sector and poultry sector in Canada are under supply management. I think it's going to be internal pressures, this growing heterogeneity, that will cause changes for it as well. In terms of agro-environmental policies, which many of you here are involved with, I think it's going to change the focus of those policies. In the past, most of the policies have been cost-share programs. We're going to provide you 50% of the cost of installing some buffers, putting in trees. That's a very typical policy across developed countries. Or it's been extension efforts. We're going to tell you, hey, here are the consequences of your actions on the environment. And you could change, you can improve by changing systems. And the other factor is that these farms have typically garnered a lot of political support. But now, they've changed. They're not that picture of the old MacDonald family that we saw early on. They're those large industrial farms, those factory farms. And they could be, we're going to treat them just like we do a steel plant or a coal plant. Okay? They're more anonymous. The other, so they don't have the same support. The other is that we now have greater ability to measure the residuals that come from each individual farm with the data that's being collected. This next point I'll bring up. We've got this growing separation of ownership and management that I think you will see in Australia as well. And one of the implications for agro-environmental policy is, who do you target? Do you target the landowner, or do you target the person managing the land? In the past, it didn't matter. It was one and the same. But now we've got 40% of the land is owned by somebody else. And so do you target the incentives, again, to the owner or to the farmer? In Alberta, there is a carbon protocol where conservation tillage is a protocol, is a practice that receives benefits, and this protocol has been widely adopted. That's because both the landowner and the farmer perceive that there are benefits. There is a protocol associated with providing incentives for fertilizer management. That's not being adopted because the landowners feel it's just the farmers who benefit. So this growing separation is important. I think it has a number of implications in terms of how we transfer these assets, and I think it's going to accelerate this separation of ownership and management. There are a number of stories in Ontario where where in the past this farm, let's say 200-acre farm, okay, that was the average size before, was worth, let's say, $300,000. Okay, $300,000 was the asset value, and the one kid who was going to take over the farm, the other kids in the family said, "Good on you. We're glad you're keeping it in the family, but we're going to be a whole lot better off, and we'll come to visit on the weekends, but thanks for continuing on, and good luck." Now those 200 acres, remember that the average size has grown, so the average would actually be 1,000 acres for a typical commercial farmer, but those 200 acres are now worth $4 million. And all of a sudden, those other siblings are saying, hey, that's a lot of assets to be transferring to Fred. How does he rate? And yet Fred's going to need a break on the selling price of those assets because the net returns are still small. Remember, the margins are small, that average cost curve that's increased that. So one of the things that's happened is that nobody's taking over the farm. All siblings join together and say, well, this is an asset we're going to own and we'll rent it out. And increasingly, we're seeing that. They can't figure out how to transfer it, so it's the next generation that owns but doesn't manage it. So only the largest are going to be able to sign. So I think we're going to see this growing. And at the same time, since there's this growing rental market, the ability for somebody like, what was her name, Maya, is going to be able to get into the market because there's land to be able to rent. Right? She doesn't want to have to own it necessarily. I think because of big data, the measurement of all farmers is going to increase. Big data allows that measurement to occur, but it's going to, I think, differ between the two different types of farmers. For those modern farmers producing range-free, producing local, producing grass-fed, it's going to be the verification of positive attributes. For those progressive farmers, it's going to be to verify that you're not doing the negative things. Are you using GMO? Are you using excess fertilizer? How are you applying your manure? Okay, so verify that you're not doing the bad things. And so that's quite a distinction. And as I mentioned earlier, a growing use of contracts to assure that. If you had #2 yellow corn, the most efficient way was to bring it to the elevator, and then we'd look at the Chicago futures price and say, we're going to adjust it for the exchange rate. Here's what you're getting. Very efficient system. But if you are producing organic corn, you need a contract. Both the farmer and the person who's buying that corn wants a contract to assure that that attribute is provided. I think this is kind of an interesting change. So this differentiation over farms, over quality attributes will increase. And if I look at what's happened with traditional farmers, or what I call the progressive farmers, initially they were dismissive. You know, somebody's gone organic. Look at all the weeds in their field. That's no way to farm. To then accepting, hey, it's good. More farmers we've got in the rural community, the better. You know, they're growing stuff, we're growing stuff, just different ways. Now they're on the defensive, right? Because people feel they're not part of the good food revolution. You know, the other Brent Prestons and Mayas are. And what we see is this need to justify the actions of conventional farming. In Guelph, there was something called a biotech boot camp on how to, I guess, spread the word about the benefits of conventional agriculture. I also think there's an increasing role for economists. And I think the management and technical skills are increasing for both sides. For progressive farmers, it's a new skill set. My father was very successful. He moved from the Netherlands to Canada because he worked hard. He worked really hard. He was smart, but he just was able to work very hard, and he got lucky. My brother was knew how to manage better. His son is an engineer who's taking over the farm. These robotic milkers require his skill set. Completely different skill sets, and to be able to market in this world. Okay? And with these new farms, these modern farms, many of them are not from a traditional agricultural background. Okay? They're from an urban environment and really don't know how things are produced. So I think there's just a growing opportunity for management and for educational skills. I think the research issues are growing. You know, the greater the heterogeneity, the more likely that there are research opportunities as well across the whole spectrum. So, to summarize, I've simplified this heterogeneity. Okay? I've put it in terms of a modern small farmer and a large progressive farmer. The reality is it's much more complex. There's got to be very large organic farmers. Okay? How does Walmart get all their organic products? Okay? It comes from a couple large organic farmers in the San Joaquin Valley. The largest dairy farmer in Canada is both an organic farmer and a conventional farmer. As soon as a cow gets mastitis on the organic farm and has to get on antibiotics, it moves to the conventional farm. Okay? So it's one of the ways of dealing with it. So it's much more mixed than that. I think those changes that we've seen have been due to changes in consumer level, but also the information that allows us to verify the attributes and has allowed this progressive farmer to go. And I think it really complicates the assessment of design and policy. And the bottom line is, and I think this is where it's probably relevant for you, it's important to examine the distribution. Rather than just the average value, examine the distribution because of this hollowing out of the middle and this growing heterogeneity that we're seeing across sectors. So, with that, I'd be happy to take